We're very fortunate again at the Arabic Hour to have with us Dr. George Corm, the ex-finance minister of Lebanon and the government of Dr. Salim al-Hus, and who has published and studied at very intimate levels and very deep levels the economic malaise of Lebanon, not really the current one, but also the history of the development of the Lebanese economy. And we're dealing with a very serious question today. The question is, the crisis remains unresolved, and there hasn't been so far any serious attempt to deal with it on a level that would be effective, efficient, and will give hope to the Lebanese that the economy could really be set on the right track, so to speak. Dr. George, how would you take what's happening now and the lack of what's happening now to deal with the crisis?
Well, what's happening now is a generalization of stealing the Lebanese economy by those in power. It is absolutely unbelievable, but it was very difficult to criticize at the time of the late Rafik Hariri, because he had such a propaganda machine to build his image that it was totally incredible. And I remember at the end of the war, we had very few debt in Lebanon. We had very few debt at the end of the war, the long civil war. And instead of taking advantage of this, the man has gone into creating more debt for Lebanon, more and more debt for Lebanon, so that he would control the Lebanese economy, which in fact happened. And I remember by the end of the so-called civil war, the central bank in Lebanon made such a big push on interest rates. It was totally irrational, between brackets irrational, because there was a lot of people taking advantage of this. And I remember Mr. Hariri at the end of the so-called civil war, he pushed interest rates at levels totally unsustainable, which was a way to paralyze Lebanon and to put it in the hand of Hariri and associates.
Absolutely true. In the sense, look, I mean, many people tend to think that the Lebanese economic crisis, and it's unexperienced. I mean, few crises in the world, actually. Some have pointed out that maybe this is one of the three major crises in the world since the early 1900s. No other country has passed in such a difficult situation as we are going through Lebanon. But the trouble is, and you and I, we teach economics, and this is really first year economics tells you that debt grows, the debt we have will grow by the amount of government deficits. And the government deficits is a shortage of revenues for what they spend and what they service the debt. And one of the major problems that you have indicated is that the high interest rate meant that whatever debt we had, we have to service it, was paying very high interest rate, so much higher than the world interest rate. And this is on top Yeah, and on top of the fact that we had a fixed exchange rate, which
Yes,
means we were paying this high interest rate in dollars rather than
yes,
just.
yes. And the prosperity of Lebanon historically was due to the floating rate of the Lebanese pound. And the Lebanese pound was appreciated, it was in demand in all the region. So it is the Hariri policies that were devastating for the country, completely devastating. And at the end of the war, we had almost no debt at the end of the war.
Yeah, this is really very interesting sense that the argument that Hariri had given that, oh, I needed to fix the exchange rate regime, I want to create a financial anchor, so whatever inflation rate we got after the war, I am able to wrestle it and bring it down. All right. I mean, it sounded like a reasonable thing, but the issue is not that you really want to use a financial anchor. The issue is, what are the consequences of a fixed exchange rate regime?
Atif, in fact, I remember very well by the end of the war, the Lebanese internal war, we had a very reputable international consultant who said that, I mean, the debt could be reimbursed quite easily, and there was no need for additional climbing of interest rates. And I remember there was a big American company who also confirmed that there was no need for interest rate, and nobody remembers that the prosperity of Lebanon was due in a large part to the floating rate that we had at the time as the exchange regime. It was floating. We didn't have a fixed rate the way Hariri instituted it. And I read at the time several reports saying that this was totally irrational. And the prosperity of Lebanon in the past has been done with floating rates and not fixed rates. The fixed rates was a way to amass a fortune for Mr. Hariri himself.
What you're mentioning is very important because let's be technical. I mean, even using some technical economics, the interest rate should really be lower than the rate of growth of GDP. If the interest rate is higher than the rate of growth of GDP, the debt would grow faster than GDP, and the debt to GDP ratio would rise.
Of course.
And that is not really sustainable.
No, the Hariri years were terrible for Lebanon. And I remember a report from a big, large investment bank saying that this was unbearable, and that due to my age, I remember that Lebanon, immediately after independence, went to floating rates and not to fixed rate, went to floating rate, and the Lebanese pound appreciated a lot at the time. It was in demand. And we even had bond issues in Beirut at the time for companies like Renault or other big names. So this idea of having fixed interest rates was devastating for Lebanon. Lebanon, in the first year of its independence, used to have floating rates, and the Lebanese pound was constantly appreciating because the economic development was going very well.
Yeah. And there was lots of inflow of capital.
And there was a lot of inflow of capital. And, even I remember when Mr. Hariri said that we needed something like $20 billion to rebuild the economy. Nobody protested. Everybody stayed quiet. Mr. Hariri was a symbol of wealth and richness, and he can't be wrong. Well, while the years of big prosperity for Lebanon were the years when the Lebanese pound was floating and it was not fixed. So
exactly. I mean, I'm going to ask you a tough question, and I'm sure you're used to it. Is there a chance that we can reset, can bring some vitality and vigor to the Lebanese economy to match what it had been able to do in the past, without holding those who squandered the money and those who transferred the huge amount of money to foreign lands, and to hold accountable all these bankers and politicians that had contributed to the demise of the Lebanese economy?
This will be very difficult, and the governor of the central bank has been paid huge amounts of money so that everybody would praise him. And up to now, he is being praised, which is something absolutely extraordinary. He has bought most of the Lebanese elite. And I mean, talking with him, the man doesn't know the economic history of Lebanon. He doesn't know that the Lebanese pound was floating at independence, was put on floats, and that it was appreciating constantly because people had confidence in the monetary system of Lebanon. Why? And so again, I mean, it's unbelievable, but Mr. Hariri had no idea about floating rates or fixed rates or his economics, his economic knowledge. It is still very restricted, was very restricted, and it's still very restricted. I wrote several papers saying, let us not forget that the prosperity of Lebanon was done on the floating rates, and the Lebanese pound was appreciating all the time. It was in demand because the people in the region had confidence in the way the Lebanese economy was managed at the time.
You know, I'm sure you saw the IMF, International Monetary Fund, rates central bank. They give them grades, like we as professors grade our students. And in 2019, weeks, maybe days, not weeks, they rated the central banker, Mr. Marwan They gave him an A. They gave
Marwan?
Yeah, and they gave the Canadian central banker a B minus, the American one a B. How on earth can the IMF give Mr. Salami such a high grade? Were they competent enough to see what was going on, or were they really motivated by some political reasons that made them make this assessment that is totally at variance with actual results?
No, but, Mr. Salami was making gifts all the time to the local bankers, and this is the policy that has ruined public finance in Lebanon. I wrote a lot of pieces about it, saying this is total craziness. How can we increase it this way? And the prosperity of Lebanon, again, happened under floating rates of the Lebanese pound. And the Lebanese pound was in demand in the whole region. I would recall that, for instance, we had Renault, a company, coming to Beirut and making a bond issue in Lebanese pounds. We had the Banque Extérieure d'Algérie, who did the same. It came to Lebanon and issued bonds also. So again, the policy of the fixed rates was a policy completely out of the interest of Lebanon.
I mean, let me just, for the benefit of our viewers, the exchange rate is very important. For one thing, if we do not allow the exchange rate to reflect the economic atmosphere and investment and be governed by the transactions, imports, exports, you may be doing an injury to the economy. Particularly, some people have always argued that the Lebanese pound was so much more valued because of its banking system, bank secrecy, hot money, money coming from other Arab countries whose political systems were not really stable, and found in Lebanon a good safe haven for it. But it militated this appreciation of the Lebanese pound against exports and the ability of Lebanon to have a productive economy. On the other hand, people also argued that, if the exchange rate depreciates, as we are now having, it contributes to inflation. We in Lebanon import almost 80% of our consumption requirement, and if the exchange rate depreciates, everything would rise in price and would become a very heavy tax on the Lebanese consumers. Where do you stand on these two issues?
Well, I think that Mr. Hariri was beginning to develop his control on the Lebanese economy, was totally incompetent. He didn't know that it is the pound appreciation that has made a big part of Lebanese prosperity, for instance. And it was terrible. I mean, ignorance, total ignorance, and absence of knowledge of how modern economies work was a total catastrophe. Total.
Absolutely.
And I remember also, I have to say that we had one of the big American engineering company, maybe the name will come back to my mind at the time, that wrote that the reconstruction of Lebanon should not cost more than $2 billion. Mr. Hariri took it out of the circulation and came back to saying that Lebanon was in need of was in need of 40 or 50 billion dollars to reconstruct. It was incredible, absolutely incredible.
No, I mean, you're putting some very good points here. One is, to a great extent, the cost of reconstruction was bloated, was inflated, and it created a disconnect between the infrastructure and how much it contributes to productivity and production, a disconnect between the debt and the capacity of the economy and its growth to pay for it, a disconnect between the amount of money you spend and the actual results that you get. So you're saying that these companies have estimated that maybe the maximum is about $2-3 billion when we spend tens and 20s. And as you said, even at one time, they floated the cost figure of $50 billion. And these were not financed by any extra production that would raise the tax revenue of the government to pay for it. So it, in many respects, was financed by borrowing.
Yeah, but Mr. Hariri had the illusion that that there was going to be peace in the region, and that then there would be prosperity through the peace in the region. This was his calculation, which is a miscalculation, of course.
Was absolutely unrealistic. No question about it. And we're paying for it now. The trouble is that Lebanese have paid for it far in excess of what benefits they got. And what's even probably worse, as you know, Dr. George, the poor have paid for it more than others. They paid for it, they paid for it in lost opportunities. You know, if the economy was productive, the high interest rate that required to finance the debt and to keep the exchange rate really created very limited number of jobs for people. So the Lebanese paid for it through high unemployment. They paid for it also in terms of the inflation that it created. They paid for it through the high interest rate that they have now to use the government revenue to pay the interest to the bankers and to the people who lend us money, rather than to invest it and create opportunities. So the story is so incredibly vicious in my view, and I'm not using my words loosely, in the sense that given the tax system that we have in Lebanon, which is basically and fundamentally depends on the value-added tax and a very inelastic income tax, in the sense that if the income increases, we still pay the same proportion. There is no progressive taxation, which means the poor would pay a greater proportion of these taxes than the rich. So to a great extent, the flawed economic policy is responsible for some of the things we have. And is there any attempt, or has there been any attempt, is there any thinking that we need to restructure the Lebanese economy and its tax system and its expenditure system and its debt in a way that would be more sustainable and would not tax the poor people of Lebanon.
Yes, but unfortunately, I mean, IMF policies in Lebanon has not been very successful. There were traditional IMF management of economies, and this hadn't helped Lebanon at all. Because it has been terrible, and after the war, Mr. Hariri should have imposed a special tax to secure the reconstruction. He didn't do this. On the contrary, income tax was lowered to 5 or 6% until his tenure. It's totally crazy thing.
See, one thing you and I agree upon, and we don't want to leave the impression that what we really have suffered in Lebanon is the result of wrong policies only. Wrong policies, 100%, I grant you. There is no question in my mind. But to what extent also, and maybe Mr. Hariri is responsible for it, is the corruption system that has developed, in which gave politicians and bankers and people with power and those who we call the al-hitan, people who are commanding heights and reaping the profits and having these exclusive agencies. To what extent policy was not the only factor, but that this corruption that has become endemic, and not this low-level corruption, this very endemic, high-level corruption, where people have earmarked billions of dollars to build universities and hospitals and have spent the money, but there is no record of it. The amount of money that have been spent to restructure and rehabilitate the electricity system, $40 billion, and there is nothing to show for it.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the management of Lebanon has been surrealistic. And of course, there was here Mr. Hariri saying all the time that Lebanon is going to big prosperity, that there's going to be normalization of relation with Israel. So it was absolutely incredible, and he didn't even know that the Lebanese pound was on a floating rate system at independence for years, and this has contributed to the prosperity of Lebanon. No, he did the contrary. He did absolutely the contrary. And of course, everybody from the governing class in Lebanon was saying yes to anything Mr. Hariri would decide. And he was convinced that peace with Israel was coming. So this made him do more blunders in terms of economic policies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've seen some real credible, nice research. They said that if we were to look back and try to understand and see the connections that these policies have to the present demise that we are going through, we can single about 8 biases, a cement bias. To a great extent, the reconstruction program meant spending so much money on rehabilitating, creating good-looking Solidaire district, central business district, roads, infrastructure, but spent very little money on the training of people, on instituting the basis of success of the new economy, which is really information and computer technology, software. He was more on the hardware than on the software.
Don't forget that he has copied the policies of the gentleman Soros, of George Soros, giving help, money help, to have people, for instance, to go and study in London, in Paris, and there were millions of dollars that went into this operation, and the Lebanese were éblouis, so that the man was a genius.
Yeah, and whatever people we trained, we made them more attractive to others to hire them, but Lebanon did not reap the benefits from them,
yes,
which is really another problem. The other thing is that there was also a import bias, in the sense that when you fix the exchange rate and fix it at an overvalued, and there is no question about it, and there is consensus here that people have felt that the exchange rate, and you've written about it too, is overvalued. And what this meant, that imports would be cheap, but our exports will be more expensive. So there is an import bias, and imports is a drain, is a leakage. And it militated against what could have really been a very substantive invigoration of the productive economy, which is exports. Exports were suppressed, imports were made more accessible and easier to have.
Yeah, and I remember when I introduced the VAT system, value-added tax in Lebanon, everybody laughed that this would never work in Lebanon, etc. And today it is one of it is the biggest item in the receipts of Lebanon.
People also, and you and I, we just covered it, there was a debt bias to a great extent. Nobody was willing, and you just mentioned that the income tax was at the lowest rate, and actually it was reduced instead of increased. Most of our reconstruction was financed borrowing rather than through debt,
Yes.
rather than taxing, and connecting the reconstruction to some productive increase so that you could tax it back to pay for it. Total
yes. Absolutely. I mean, we came out of 15 years of internal disturbances in Lebanon, civil war between Lebanese factions, and when Mr. Khalili came to power, he didn't at all think of any type of compensation for the people who had their assets lost during the 15 years of war. Nobody. He was hinting all the time that we're going to have a relation with Israel, and this would be great. This would give a boost to the Lebanese economy. This is what was behind his mind.
We mentioned a lot of negative points, and they're not really intended to make people pessimistic things. But now, given all these situations, is there still hope? Is there still a possibility? Is still a way in which we can get the Lebanese economy from the terrible, implosive state it's in to replay, to reinvigorate it in a way that would become more sustainable and would become more equitable, and between classes, between sex, between gender. I mean, there is really any hope that we can rebuild Lebanon?
No, with the present nomenclature of Lebanon, you cannot. It will always be I mean, getting money in a very bad way, in a destructive way. This is not possible. And, we came out of the 15 years of war with still our foreign exchange reserves very high, and he had completely lost them. He had spent them very stupidly without any productive impact of his policies.
You see, we're at the cusp now. I mean, you just mentioned that the war was debilitating. The war destroyed the infrastructure, destroyed the reputation of Lebanon as an economy that was flourishing. It completely dislodged the growth rate that was achieved. And some people have dubbed it the Lebanese economic miracle of the 50s and 60s. And we were able to throw back all these negativities and started the Lebanese economy on a more vigorous growth track. Is there a chance that we can do it now? And what have we learned from the past that can be helpful for us in redoing it?
No, I'm not very optimistic. The lords of the war that are governing Lebanon today, it's all these people that are responsible for thousands of deaths that are now governing Lebanon, and we had the governor of the central bank also being somebody with very stupid policies, but so it's not easy at all. I tried to speak to Mr. Hariri at one time, saying, well, let's try to convince him to change his policies, because these are destructive policies. But yes, I sat with him for 1 hour or 2 hours, but nothing came out of it. I explained him that at independence, Lebanon went into floating rates, and not at all in a fixed exchange rate. Fixed exchange rate almost does not exist today. I mean, the country that would go to fixed exchange rate is going to suicide.
There is now, Dr. George, and would be a nice way to maybe end our discussion. There is now quite a bit of discussion of people who really want to create federalism. I mean, one thing, most of the discussion seemed to be purely political and have completely neglected the economic consequences of fragmenting an already fragmented small economy. Is there a chance that this federalism they're talking about could be another economic disaster?
Yes, of course. Federalism on 10,000 square kilometers. It's an absurdity. It's a total absurdity. So it's only people that want to grab more money from the poor Lebanese. It's absolutely awful.
And it's amazing, Dr. George, is that in the discussion about this, very few people have invoked any of the economic, disastrous logic that these people are using when this is a time when the European Union, the ASEANs, everybody trying to organize themselves and to get into bigger economic arrangements, and we in Lebanon going the exact opposite. Okay, let's make every village an independent entity. Many of us, including myself, have argued that there is a responsibility for people in the diaspora, so to speak, outside Lebanon, immigrants, and who care about Lebanon, and who have their families and have their friends and have been brought up, educated, and trained. They have a responsibility here. And many of us think we should and we can do things, but we are thwarted. Nobody has come up with very credible and practical ways of trying to organize the efforts of people in the different countries to which they have emigrated to do something. Is there a chance, a hope, and what would really take to do this?
But there have been attempts, but the attempts were totally spoiled by the rivalry between different Lebanese factions. It was terrible.
Dr. George, that Lebanese outside have sent a lot of money. Some people estimate it to be anything above $6 billion, and they're expecting that this year it could top $11 billion, and that this money that they have sent to help their families or have come to Lebanon themselves as tourists, so to speak. And how much can we count on this money, or has this money made any dent in the outlook of the Lebanese economy?
No, unfortunately not, because people are transferring money to their families, and so you have a distribution of this positive aid, but you have a distribution which is again taken prisoner of the confessional system in Lebanon. The confessional system in which we are living is totally crazy, totally crazy. And as long as it will continue, and as long as we'll have Mr. Salami as the governor of the central bank, let's forget about it.
Something has to be done, and many of us are puzzled. For example, the French court system is going after Mr. Salami and has to some extent accused him with a number of financial crimes and corruption. Why is Lebanon still absolutely, totally hung up without any attempt to try to see how can we extricate ourselves from this quagmire we put ourselves in?
Well, Atif, I have qualified the bankers in Lebanon as being as creating a bankocracy. It is the Lebanese banks that are dictating the economic policies today under Riyad Salami inspiration. So it's not easy. it demand that less people would be all the time preoccupied by the equilibrium between the Sunni, the Shia, the Maronite, the Greek Orthodox. Then they are preoccupied by the situation. So we're living a Bangkokracy. I call it a Bangkokracy that we have to dismantle. But it's not an easy task.
Yeah, we have too many of these on the same. They rhyme together. Kleptocracy,
Yeah.
and the incredible obstinacy of those who have destroyed the Lebanese miracle and have escaped any accountability. I hope that the situation will improve. I mean, as you can say, there are very limited signs that would make people hopeful. But I'm hoping that the next meeting we meet together, maybe, and the hope is something has to give. And the Lebanese political class and the confessional system that we keep nurturing has spawned mafia-like sects, where every sect has its own mafia, its own family, so to speak, that is trying to undo and to sap the energies and the wealth of Lebanon. It's time that we hold these people accountable. And your writing have always been an illuminating light in all these issues, and hope that you be continuing to contribute. And we tell you, we appreciate in the Arabic Hour so much that you have given us the time and have, despite all the difficulties, personal and social and otherwise, have given us the wisdom of your knowledge. And we look forward to a lot more discussions with you. Thank you very much.
Okay. It was my pleasure.
It is our pleasure.